We cannot forget that this is all connected to a bigger ecosystem, which is called planet Earth. And I think that's our challenge.
Hi, and welcome to NRCC's 2021 Virtual Jackson Hole Wildlife Symposium. This video is one of a series of keynote conversations with leaders on human-wildlife coexistence across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This conversation features Franz Camenzind. Franz has lived in Jackson, Wyoming for over 50 years. During this span, he has become one of Jackson's leading voices for conservation through his writing, advocacy, filmmaking, and research. He began his career as an independent environmental consultant after receiving a PhD in zoology from the University of Wyoming, studying the ecology and behavior of coyotes. From there, he spent many years as a filmmaker, producing films on a long list of species, both here in Wyoming and across the globe. Franz spent 13 years as executive director for the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance, where he led the alliance to some of their significant achievements that shaped the organization it is today. He was one of the founding members of the Greater Yellowstone Coalition and continues to serve on boards across the GYE, as well as being a member of NRCC's Board of Advisors. You can read many of his articles in support of wildlife and protection of landscapes in many of our regional publications, including Wyophile and Mountain Journal. So welcome to Franz, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure, actually an honor to be here. That introduction was a little bit embarrassing. I guess I wish my parents were here to hear that. They finally know what I was up to all my life. But thank you.
Of course. So given your longtime engagement in the GYE with many aspects of the human connection to wildlife, how the public talk about wildlife, policy that is we use to manage wildlife, growth and development's effect on populations, could you describe what you see are some of the key challenges to human-wildlife coexistence? And then the second part of that question is, how has your own skill set and background prepared you for that type of work?
I guess I would start with perhaps the last question first. Where I'm spending my time right now, and actually most of my professional life, was dealing with, I guess, threatened and endangered species, but also apex species. Those are at the top of the pyramid, so to speak. And I do that because that sort of is an umbrella approach to ultimately what is the most important, which is habitat protection. So if we, can get the habitat for something like the grizzly bear or wolves or whatever in a protected state, then we're doing well for a lot of other species too. And then on the side to that, of course, is the threatened and endangered species. I think for the most part, what I'm really concerned about is getting the public more aware of where we are. So I think there's a lot of challenges out here, and I think the NRCC plays an important role there because they are housing a number of research projects and sort of a home base for projects. But I think also because it's important to convey whatever we learn and continue to learn to the greater public so that they can make better informed decisions. And ultimately, if the public is there to support our needs, our desires as professional ecologists, then I think we'll move forward in a good direction. Here in Jackson, I think it's sort of a microcosm of everything that's going on, certainly in our country, but it's all focused in one area, in one valley in a way. Many people move here because they love wildlife. They love the outdoors, however that's defined. And they really don't understand that sometimes pursuing that image of wildlife or pursuing that enjoyment outdoors has its impacts. It may change the behavior of the animal on an individual basis, and it may change the behavior of a population because of where we've decided to build our homes or construct our pathways that we like to walk, the trails in the mountains and so forth. So, these are our best intentions. We come here, many of us come here wanting to enjoy all this, but cumulatively, we're having an impact.
And that actually is a good lead into my next question. I'm just curious to like, how would you describe the overall management strategy or just the way we talk about wildlife here in the GYE or in Jackson? And how has that changed in your own lifetime here in Jackson?
I came here first time in 1969 to start my coyote research, and I moved here in 1970. And at that time, we had a lot of room for error, if you will, certainly more room than we do now. There weren't as many people. The visitation was much lower than what it is now. We could make decisions about maybe this development or that development, knowing that there was other space available yet. But as that development has built upon itself, we have narrowed that gap. We have narrowed that place where wildlife can live, or perhaps most importantly, the corridors that they have to move through to get from one habitat from one season to another habitat in another season. And we don't have room for error like we did 50 or 100 years ago. We have to be much more careful. I'll use one example, and it relates to Jackson Hole, but certainly the ecosystem, is all the work that's being done now in the past decade on migration corridors. And it's interesting because we've been very successful at finding migration corridors for animals like the pronghorn antelope, and recognizing that they travel 100 to 150 miles in the course of one season, just from one point to another. And with the collaring and the telemetry that we have, satellite telemetry, we've documented those migration corridors in some places down to 20, 30, 40 yards wide, critical bottlenecks, if you will. And as good as that is, I think there are some people who think, well, we've, one, protected the animal because we know the corridors and we're going to protect them. But the downside of that, there are people who think, well, all that other land now is sort of open for development of some sort. But that other land is still habitat for the resident pronghorn that lived there, for the resident deer, for the resident, prairie dogs and ground squirrels and fox and eagles and falcons and all of that. So just because we've identified a migration corridor for one species doesn't mean we can give up that habitat because there are other species that still depend on it. So it's kind of a double-edged sword when we talk about science and research as to how it's used and how it's interpreted. We feel good. We've identified it, we saved it. But there's a lot more to this than that.
It's a great point. I guess I would like to, do you think we're using the corridor story as our main development strategy when we're thinking about towns in the GYE? Is that becoming the central paradigm for how we're managing growth patterns?
It's the paradigm du jour. That's what we're working on today. And it's all necessary. All of this is necessary. Our challenge is to know what all of these species need, how these parts work, how they exist, what their needs are, how they fit into the system. But just as important is to know how the system needs all of those parts to continue to function properly. And that really takes us into that ecosystem concept, that bigger picture, that bigger landscape picture, and it's a bigger mental picture also. And when the Greater Yellowstone Coalition was formed, I was on that founding board. And as a biologist on the board, I was asked to write a definition of the ecosystem, and I did that. I wrote it sort of using our elk population as sort of a figure that helped define it, because they are essentially in every corner of this ecosystem. And I had to make it very clear that that was sort of a false spotlight that we were using, because our Swainson's hawks that summer here winter in the Pampas and the Argentine in South America. So isn't that part of our ecosystem too? And our hummingbirds, which just showed up today at my bird feeders for the first time. They were on the Gulf Coast and possibly in northern part of South America. Isn't that part of the ecosystem also? So from a management standpoint, we have to form a boundary, a political boundary where decisions can be made. And So you step back and say, okay, this is sort of the ecosystem, but we cannot forget that this is all connected to a bigger ecosystem, which is called planet Earth.
I think that's a great point. My question, my last question in this sort of area of questions is related to the COVID pandemic that we're living in right now. And given that it has roots in the interactions of humans and wildlife, and the science seems to be more and more confident that the root cause of this type of disease is from the loss of habitat, on sort of a higher level, I'm curious what you think, how you think this pandemic has changed the general awareness of these types of interactions, if they have changed, and if we are seeing our reliance on habitat in a different light.
For very good reason, very tragic reasons, the pandemic has really shown us, if we're actually seeing it, it is showing us that we are all part of one population now on this planet Earth. Something that happens in China will impact us. Those of us who've been sort of in the sciences for a long time understood that a long time ago. We're all part of this, and we're all in this together now. And the pandemic has definitely shown that to us in a very negative way, but it should wake us up for the rest of the environment around us.
And I think that's what you do so well in your writing is to create a more holistic and complex story of our interactions with wildlife. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your writing process, and how do you think about connecting with an audience around a message around interactions with humans and wildlife in a way that's going to attract and captivate and get at people's attention?
The way you've asked that question, you're assuming that it's working. I guess I approach my writing, it's very difficult for me. I get sidetracked into the details, and I go off on tangents. As good as accomplished as Google is, it's also a real distraction. I remember when I started doing this work back in the 70s as a graduate student, actually in Utah, already doing my master's work before that. But here in Jackson, instead of going to Laramie to the library, which was, a day's drive away, I would go to the library at Logan. But that was how I was getting my information. Either that, or I'd call someone up and say, can you send me a copy of your article? In terms of writing, I guess I tend to fall back on the idea that set up a historic base to work off of. Where did this come from, or what did we go through to get here? We have this question today, but it's probably not the first question relating to that subject. So I try to set up a historic base and give some perspective. I think too many people, particularly here in Jackson and the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, think that history started the day that their Mayflower dropped off all their goods and their children and their pets and stuff at their doorstep. History started a long time before that. The human history was thousands of years before that, and the geologic history, of course, millions, tens of millions of years before that. And our cultural history, too, and our environmental history, and our legal history surrounding our environmental movement. All of those things come into play. And I rarely write about an individual species. I try, for whatever reason, to write about the bigger issue, the landscape issue. Because if we can protect the landscape, we're a long way toward protecting the species that we, the fuzzy ones that we like, and the charismatic ones, and sometimes even the microfauna that some people actually are aware of. So, and then I try to keep it simple. My vocabulary by nature is not very expansive, so that's not hard to do, keep it simple, but keep the thought patterns. Hopefully they bind together and they make sense for people. That's all I can hope for. One of the things that's influenced me a lot when I started working with coyotes and before that on my master's with golden eagles was how getting to know those species have impacted my thinking about all this. And when I was doing the film work that you mentioned, the 25 years of documentary film work for television, and it was truly an eye-opening experience for me. I remember spending almost 2 months down in the Amazon in Colombia. There's a little piece of Colombia that actually touches the river. And flying out of there it was 1976, and flying out of there, coming home, and looking across the Amazon basin, and as far as I could see, it was just this green canopy, um, absolutely awe-inspiring. And knowing that I had just spent almost 2 months down in this tiny little thread right along the river, and then later that same day, flying into Jackson and looking out and actually understanding that there were boundaries to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I wasn't thinking of ecosystem at that point, but understanding that that's the edge of where we are. Everything beyond that edge is domesticated. It's a pinpoint when compared to the Amazon basin. And as such, I started realizing how critical and how important and how fragile and how threatened and how beautiful this area was. So I really became more, I guess, aware, and my thinking started from that point. Um, and since then, I've been lucky enough to work on black-footed ferrets, photographically, cinematographically, and also California condors. And in the past year, a little over a year now, I've sort of reconnected some of those dots, and I visited condors that are now flying free, and I visited black-footed ferrets that are now living free. And my first introduction to both of those was during the capturing and the discovery with Susan Clark of the ferret population and working on it over Matisse. And then on condors, when they were doing the trapping of the last 22 wild condors, and wondering, while I was sitting in the blind, if I'd ever see them flying wild. So my point here is that we've done a lot of good things. We brought things back from the brink of extinction. Humanity can do that, but it comes at a big price, literally a financial price. It's tens of millions of dollars have been spent on both of those programs. And adjustments have been made culturally. Seeing these species free again in the environment, although a fraction of their historic numbers, has been very rewarding to me and gives me encouragement that we can do this. But the crux to it all is human nature, human behavior. And until we modify that, we're just putting Band-Aids out there. We've got to cure the disease, not just treat it.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful comparison with the Amazon basin and the greater Yellowstone region. My last question is definitely related to this ecosystem concept, because it's been more than 150 years since Yellowstone was named a national park, and it's been over 30 years since we've started to use that ecosystem concept, which I'm curious from your perspective, how have we as an environmental professional field, or advocates, or however you want to define it, moved the dial to a better future for wildlife here in the region? And are we integrating that ecosystem idea?
I think one of the things that I have to remind myself of, and certainly the folks that live here in the ecosystem, we've done a lot of things right. When I came here in 1970, there were 9 bison in the valley, 9. We've been over 1,000, now it's around 500. So that population has rebounded, fantastically. When I came here, if there was a wolf sighting in the valley, it literally made the newspaper. And it was usually up in the north end of the valley, right off the Teton Wilderness in Buffalo Valley and that area. There were no wolves, of course. There were no wolves. And when I was doing my coyote research, I remember absolutely wondering if I'd ever hear, not just see, but hear a wolf in the ecosystem. And of course, now we have them. Our trumpeter swan population has held its own. It's probably at capacity. Bald eagle population is probably at carrying capacity. Antelope population is holding its own, and it's growing some since the 70s. Black bears, we have peregrine falcons through a hacking process that they conducted in the 1970s and early 80s. We have a resident, or not a resident, but well, it is a resident population, not year round. So I think we've done a lot of things right, and we can continue to do that. But we talk about carrying capacity. Our elk population is at the objective level here, and then the state is way over objective. But we don't talk about the most critical aspect of this discussion. What is the human carrying capacity? And we don't bring that up. We don't measure it. Superintendent Finley, past superintendent of Yellowstone Park, I remember made, I think the first question or put it in this manner was, the least understood or least researched species in the ecosystem is the human. That's absolutely true. And we don't even talk about the human species in terms of carrying capacity. How many more homes can we build in Jackson Hole, in Cody, in Du Bois, or in Bozeman, West Yellowstone, all of these peripheral communities, or Idaho Falls even, Billings, and it goes on and on. And that's the resident carrying capacity. Then we have the visitation carrying capacity. And how many more people can we handle there? The Park Service, both Yellowstone and Grand Teton, have been pretty good about not putting more, how should we say, beds or pillows in their parks. But the communities continue to build more motels and, on and on and on. So where is that carrying capacity? And again, getting back to the good intentions of humans that come here, they want to go out and enjoy this. And I can't stop them. I mean, it's not my right to stop them. But how many more times and how many more summers can we have where parking lots are overflowing maybe half a mile out onto the highways, away from, the designated parking areas? How many times will people be happy walking on a backcountry trail or half backcountry and never being out of sight of another human or out of hearing range of another human conversation? When will they just adjust to that because it's better than where they came from? Or will enough people stand up and say, no, that's not what my experience anymore, and either stop coming or start getting on the bandwagon to try to modify human behavior? I hate to say control because that's too intrusive, but and that's I think is our biggest challenge: is how do we deal with the human population?
I think you've given us a history of the last 30 years in a more full sense than I think I've had yet on these conversations. So I'm also curious how, for you just personally, how is your own assumptions and understanding of your role in this? I know you started out as more of a biologist, but then moved into a communicator in a lot of ways. How has your own worldview and assumptions about that changed over the last 30 years?
I'm going to have a hard time answering that without repeating a lot of what I've said. I think that I understand the larger landscape needs of most species. And if we want to maintain biodiversity, I think that's, that aspect of it. This idea of 30 by 30, protecting 30% of our land by 2030, I think is an absolutely phenomenal idea. It's a great goal. And protection doesn't necessarily mean turning everything into a refuge, a park, or a wilderness area. There are different levels that, at which we can protect landscapes that still benefit most of the native species, plants and animals. I'm not giving up. I mean, I guess that's the bottom line, and I just have to accept that. I can just hope that there are other people out there who are getting the itch and understanding that getting involved and being conservationists, it's really a good career, even in retirement. When I was watching coyotes, that's what I was doing, a lot of watching. And I guess I realized that patience was of a necessity. And of course, that carried over in the film work too. Patience is of necessity, but also it is work. You have to be out there. And I think I'm still feeling that way. I still have patience, and yet I feel like the pressure is mounting. It's sort of pulling me in both directions, one to sit in my comfortable chair more and one to get out and do more. And I suspect that's a challenge that most of my colleagues are facing, and the younger generation of scientists and the citizen scientists. I just encourage them to go on, not get overwhelmed, but not give up. Focus, but don't focus too narrowly. Think broadly, but work locally on specific issues. It's all of that put together, and figure it out.
All right. Well, with that, I will say thank you, Franz, for being here and sharing so much. That was really enlightening for me, and I'm sure the audience as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and I wish you all, and I wish NRCC a very good future. Thank you.